Thank you, Chris, for the introduction. This is Robert. I'm here with Ray. Ray, can I get a hello?
Hi, good morning, and in some instances, good afternoon, Robert.
Together we're here going to have a conversation about the legal and reserve study issues involved in selecting reserve components. There are some very important practical issues, state law issues, and National Reserve Study standards that influence what an association should be funding through reserves. Now, I'm sure you've come with some questions, and I want to make sure this time is valuable for you. So on your screen, you'll see a dialog box. Chris alluded to it earlier. If you have a question now, or if at any time a question comes to mind, please just type it into that dialog box, and Chris will be monitoring that. We'll try to answer as many as we can in the time available after we've finished our prepared content. An outline will be available after the webinar summarizing today's curriculum, extra questions that we didn't have time to get to, and some basic reserve study principles. So it'll be a great resource for you to keep on file. And in addition, Ray and I enjoy speaking live in front of audience, so we enjoy getting your actual feedback. So there's a hands raised icon that you'll see to be able to respond to any questions that we might ask. So let's start off with some audience participation. So everyone grab your mouse and click the hands raised icon. Oh, very good. Very good. Okay, you're with us. Okay, I'm going to click everyone's hands down, and it's time to start. So first off, let me ask Ray, what is the association trying to accomplish here?
Well, the fundamental obligation of the association is to protect, maintain, and in some instances even enhance the association's assets. Typically, reserve expenses are so large that it takes many years for the association to set aside these funds, and that has a good side effect of spreading out the contributions over a number of years while the owners are continuing to enjoy these assets.
Well, let's get right down to it. You're an attorney in Florida, Ray. Which reserve components are required to appear in the association's budget?
Well, for condominiums in the state of Florida, there's actually 4 statutorily required reserve funds, and those are for roof replacement, building painting, and pavement resurfacing. And then there's a 4th category, which is meant to be a catch-all category, and that's for any other item for which a deferred maintenance or replacement cost expense exceeds $10,000. And let's be careful, because those 4 statutory requirements are not the complete list. Associations should be reserving for many components, and we'll get into some of the other requirements as we go through the material here. And I do want to make a distinction between condominium associations and homeowners associations. In Florida, those are two different beasts, if you will, and I know that there are folks who are listening who may be outside the state of Florida, and those terms may be used interchangeably, but whenever I speak about condos, I'm talking about a specific form of ownership where the owners are responsible for maintaining their units, and they actually own a pro rata share of the common elements, whereas in a homeowners association, the homeowner is just responsible for maintaining their home. And I know that that may be a source of confusion, so that would be a good time, if anyone needs clarification on that, maybe to use that chat box that we were speaking about.
Okay, now do homeowners associations have that same list?
Well, that's interesting, because at least in the state of Florida, homeowners associations don't have that list, and they're governed by a different set of rules. They're a lot more liberal. They're sort of the Wild West, if you will. So there's a sort of a different set of standards that apply to homeowners associations. But in most circumstances, as we'll see, homeowners associations are required to set aside a reserve for certain assets.
Let's take it one step further, and let me ask that same question about co-ops.
That's interesting that you say that, because in the state of Florida, there are cooperative associations. There are not as many as, say, in other states, like in New York, where they're very prevalent. but there are cooperatives in the state of Florida, and they are governed by their own set of rules. But for the most part in the state of Florida, cooperatives are dealt with pretty much the same as condominium associations, and at least with respect to reserves, they sort of are almost identical.
Okay, well, let's focus on condominiums for a minute, since the law in Florida is specific about their reserve component requirements. Should they reserve for more than just the roofing, building painting, pavement resurfacing, or the projects over $10,000? Is an association safe by basically staying with that restrictive list, or is that just a starting point?
Oh, that's interesting, because that is really just the starting point. An association shouldn't just stop at this short list that's set forth in the statute. And the bottom line is that reserves are needed by association for both condos, HOAs, and cooperatives for major projects that cannot be absorbed by the annual operating budget. If it's a major capital project and doesn't appear in the operating budget, on a practical level, in addition to meeting the statutory requirements, the association should be budgeting for those as well.
Great. Okay. Well, with respect to, again, condominiums, do you often, or is it rarely, see reserve component requirements mandated by the governing documents? And if so, how often does that come into play and interfacing with the statutory reserve requirements?
Well, it's often the case that associations, especially condominium associations in the state of Florida, and especially ones that are located in our coastal cities, which is pretty prevalent here in Florida, they have additional unique facilities. They may have boat docks, they may have boat basins, seawalls, some have private beaches. So a lot of them have additional facilities above and beyond what's required in the statute, and those reserve requirements are going to be set forth in the association's governing documents. So the association needs to look at the statute merely as a starting point, and then go to its governing documents, see what the governing documents require as well.
Great. Well, let me just back up for just a moment and ask everyone in attendance by a show of hands. Can I get a show of hands for everyone who's listening in from the state of Florida? So raise your hands if you're from the state of Florida. I want to help gauge our comments here. Okay, Ray, it looks like, looking out, it looks like about half the people are from Florida. So we have a lot of interested participants from Florida, but we'll try to keep our comments general also. Okay, I'm going to put everyone's hands down. Thank you very much. Let me ask another question. What if the condominium association paints all the common areas throughout the year with a painting crew? Can they do that through the operating budget, not reserves, if they clearly disclose what they're doing? Can they go beyond what the state law says?
As far as doing one of these capital projects, such as painting, through the operating budget, so long as they are disclosing that in the operating budget, and the operating budget covers the expenses for that particular year, it's going to be perhaps okay if they do it that way. I would still caution them that if there's any amounts that are going to be needed in the reserve above and beyond the expenses for that year, that they do need to be reserving for them.
Great. Okay. Well, let me continue to follow up on paintings, and since that's one of typically the big three expenses across the country. What do you say to associations who object to funding for painting or asphalt seal coating through reserves, since according to IRS guidelines they aren't considered capital projects?
Well, the answer to that is very simple. You should prepare your taxes according to the IRS guidelines, and you should prepare your reserve budgets according to the National Reserve Standards and your local state and your local state statutory requirements. But let me ask you, Robert, in your experience, are there other states, being that we have probably about half of our listeners that are located outside the state of Florida, are you aware of any other states that have a similar list of required components? And if so, do you have perhaps an example of those?
Well, there aren't very many. We do business in the vast majority of states across the country, what we've seen, interestingly enough, is that the state of Washington just passed a new law that went into effect January 1st of this year, 2012, requiring roofing, painting, paving, the three required in Florida, and in the addition, decks, siding, plumbing, windows, and then they have the same catch-all type of category, but they identified it a little bit differently. Anything that's over 1% of the annual budget, and those are the things that they want the association to be reserving for. So instead of the Florida 3 plus anything significant, in the state of Washington they have the big 7 plus anything significant.
All right. Now you mentioned the National Reserve Study Standards. What are those standards? Do they have particular components such as these that are required by the National Reserve Study Standards?
Well, National Reserve Study Standards were published in 1998 after it was a multi-year cooperative development process by reserve study professionals from across the country. Every time we had a CAI national conference, we got into a room and discussed and pushed ideas, and we finally came together with a stable national set of standards. And so they're published and promoted by the Community Associations Institute, which we know as CAI. It's the for those of you who aren't aware, it's the national trade organization for the community association industry. Those standards have a 4-part test to determine if a component is appropriate for funding through reserves. So that test is that a component needs to be a common area maintenance responsibility, it needs to be life limited, needs to have a predictable remaining useful life, you need to be able to put a number on it, and it needs to be above a minimum threshold cost of significance. Now what we see is typically that's the board or the manager's signature authority, and that's often, for those of you who are managers or board members, that's you'll find that typically about 0.5% or 1% of the association's annual budget.
All right, can you elaborate a little bit further? Is that a master checklist, or is that
Well, it's interesting, and I see it almost like when I read about an important court case where the judge in the matter establishes a list of questions to help define what the solution is, and that's what National Reserve Study Standards are. They're a list of questions. Does it fit A? Does it fit B? Does it, the 4-part test? And so it's a 4-part test, not a master checklist.
Okay, and is there ever a conflict between the National Reserve Study Standards and perhaps the state law where you've had some experience with?
No. Now, one thing that's interesting is you can see how National Reserve Study Standards supports exactly the kind of requirements that states like Washington and Florida have attempted to create in their checklist. But rather than identify specific components, the National Reserve Study Standards identifies the types of projects that should be funded through reserves. Those, by definition, are the types of projects listed by the individual states. The state lists are nice, they're short, but I believe the National Reserve Study Standards 4-part test is much more effective in helping associations identify the components appropriate for reserves that are not being funded through the operating budget.
And what about gray areas or areas where there may be some discretion on behalf of the board members?
Gray area in the world of condominiums? Well, let me talk about that a moment. For things like replacing an entryway sign, something that may be a small project to a 200-unit association, they might successfully handle that by in-house staff or through the ongoing budget. Something like that may be a significant expense to a 20-unit association. And one association may replace pool furniture on a piece-by-piece basis as needed, but another may wish to purchase an entirely new set for $5,000. And for many associations, $5,000 is a significant amount of money. For those types of associations, it would be nice to have that $5,000 waiting in reserves rather than depleting the association's entire $5,000 annual miscellaneous category in the budget. So it's all about custom fit. association sizes, the different types of assets they have, the different ways they handle their expenditures, all tend to make that four-part test more effective than a checklist that's meant for associations to refer to. So it's all about having the reserve component list be a custom fit for each association.
Okay, so it's not a one-size-fits-all type of analysis, and maybe you may want to explain that just a little bit better.
Sure. What we see is that we're mostly concerned with associations that look at a simple list of requirements and feel that if they do what's on the list, they're good to go. That's the biggest mistake associations make in a state where there is a required list. There's simply too many major predictable projects for any one state list to be appropriate, effective, or comprehensive. An association needs to look at what they're trying to accomplish, like what you stated at the beginning, to protect and maintain their assets. And for all those major assets not covered in the ongoing operational budget, they need to be identified and addressed through reserves.
Okay, so it would behoove the unit owners, and not just the board, but actually the members of the association, to stay vigilant each year to make sure that the board is properly funding its reserve accounts to take care of the common areas. But can you tell me on a practical level, how long is an appropriate reserve component list?
Well, we don't want any association to have too long of a list to make it cumbersome. The majority of our associations have a reserve component list between 25 and 35 components. After you identify the major projects, you start realizing that the smaller projects are too indeterminate or too small of a cost to be handled through reserves. Minor projects successfully fall off the reserve component list and are and should be handled through the ongoing operational maintenance budget.
Okay, I periodically, again, I don't mean to harp on Florida, but I periodically, and given the fact that we have a hurricane pending coming our way early next week, I periodically get asked about appropriate reserves for insurance deductibles. And sometimes those insurance deductibles on the casualty insurance policies can be very, very large. What's your opinion on reserves as far as insurance deductibles are concerned?
Well, that's a great question, Ray, but let me turn it back. It's not really my opinion that matters. It's a good example of applying National Reserve Study standards. Wind, earthquake, hailstorms, or ice storms, whatever natural hazard affects your association, causes damage. So it passes test number 1. But the timing is uncertain, so insurance deductibles fail test number 2 and number 3. So the quick answer is that National Reserve Study standards say no to reserving for insurance deductibles. It's difficult to budget for something that you don't know fundamentally when it's going to happen. But in many cases, being prepared to meet such a deductible, as you say, a big deductible, is a practical necessity. So we counsel our associations to establish a nominal expenditure on a defensible interval based on their association's experience. It may be every 5 or 10 years. That gives them the timing and cost figures they need in order to plan through reserves, so they can have something there in reserves to get them started. It may mean, depending on their problem, that a supplemental special assessment is necessary, but at least they'll have some reserves that they can draw from.
Okay, and I think a little bit later on we're going to be going through the practical procedures of taking care of those things when they come up through special assessments and borrowing and things like that. But let me ask you this, how do you feel about ongoing maintenance projects that aren't listed in the reserve study?
Well, you mentioned the key words. If they're ongoing maintenance projects, you shouldn't be funding those same projects through reserves. Doing so is something we call double budgeting. That's the opposite of when the project is missed, when it happens neither in the operating or reserve budget.
And that's an interesting point. At the other end of the scale, is there perhaps an asset's useful life that makes that project just too far away for proper reserve planning?
Well, Ray, you're probably getting the idea that I keep going back to National Reserve Study standards. If the project can be anticipated with reasonable certainty, both its useful life and remaining useful life, it should appear in the reserve study. There's no magic limit, 20 or 30 years beyond which you can reasonably ignore the expense. There's plenty of very expensive projects like elevator systems or some roofing systems with life expectancies longer than 30 years. It's only fair that owners who are using the components should be paying their fair share of deterioration within those 30 or more years.
Okay, so how does an association deal with those surprises, those major expenses that come up that don't appear in the reserve study?
Well, we've said it time before, the board's first responsibility is to maintain and protect the association assets. So when a surprise happens, we're going to always counsel our association clients to arrange to pay the expense in a timely manner. It's secondary to figure out how to account for that expenditure. So if it's not an insurable loss, you compare the expense to National Reserve Study standards. Sometimes surprises happen that in hindsight should have appeared in the reserve study, revealing something. In that case, pay for it through reserves and add that to your project component list in the next reserve study update. That's just another reason to expect to adjust and update your reserve study on a regular basis. If it's not appropriate to fund something from reserves and it's not an insurable loss, then it's probably special assessment time. Let me, I've been doing a bunch of the answers. Let me turn it back to you. Ray, in addition to being surprised, suppose the association just simply doesn't have the money and they have to pass that special assessment or borrow from a bank. What are some of the complications you see when associations don't have enough money?
Well, that's a good question. Some of the practical problems, the economies aside, with respect to passing a special assessment, is you have to actually assess folks. You have to go through the procedures of properly noticing the communities, the expense of mailing, and when it comes to borrowing, that in the current state of the economy has been difficult, depending upon how the delinquencies are in a specific association. Generally speaking, if an association had more than 5% of its owners delinquent, a bank probably wouldn't touch them. Now, those standards have been risen in the recent years because of the economic downturns, but in most circumstances, even when you go to borrow the money as opposed to specially assessing your individuals, a lot of times the banks are going to require that you specially assess anyway as collateral on the loan. They want to be able to see that the associations are making a concerted effort to collect these funds in order to pay for the borrowing, the premiums on the borrowing, in addition to funding, obviously, its operating expenses as well as its reserve expenses. Board individuals really need to take into consideration, these issues. Figure out what's best for the association. Borrowing, again, for these large projects is going to be spread out over a number of years, and then they have to worry about the other issues that are going to come up during those later years. If you take out a 15-year loan and you've got a major project that's going to be coming due within 5 years, they obviously need to make sure that the reserves are up to par so that it doesn't default on the loan. I guess some of the issues that you see with when the boards don't provide for the proper funding of the reserves, you're going to have some issues where some folks may look to hold individual board members personally liable. That's never a good idea because suing the association of the board members individually isn't going to solve the problem of fixing a leaking roof. So it's always best for an association to budget responsibly, take care of their major common expenses, and the things that we've been talking about. And that brings up another point. Is there, Robert, a way to reliably measure, just so board members can perhaps go home and sleep at night? Is there a proper way to rely?
We don't want to scare everyone here today.
Well, no, but can they take some solace in making sure that there's a reliable way to measure the strength of the reserve fund? Well, that was so that they can reduce the risk.
The answer is yes. That was one of the great things that came from National Reserve Study standards. It's a term called percent funded. Percent funded is a comparison of the association's actual reserve fund size to the reserve deterioration at the association. When the reserve cash equals the value of the deterioration at the association, they have balance, and it's called 100% funded. When the reserve cash is less than the deterioration, they're in a deficit situation, and the percent funded is obviously less than 100. And for those associations with more reserve cash than deterioration, they're in a surplus situation. The more extreme their deficit, meaning the closer their percent funded gets to zero, the more risk they have of a special assessment. And it should come up in a second or two, but this is the chart that we've been able to compile based on about 10,000 associations across the country. You can see that as the percent funded grows closer to zero near the top of the page, the risk of special assessment goes way up.
Okay, so this is a service that a professional could provide to the association so that the board members have at least something tangible that they can rely upon. And this tool actually, Robert, can it predict when the need for a special assessment is going to arise?
It can predict the probability of a special assessment. It can't pick it down to the day or month, but it clearly shows the chance of an association having a special assessment in any given year. And I just want to emphasize that special assessments are primarily due to years of under-reserving. Board member budget choices, association choices. Special assessments are primarily due to how an association has run the operation. It's not primarily due to just bad luck.
Okay, so the reserve study really presumes that the study itself has an adequate list of components. So if they're ignoring major components, even if they go through this analysis, it's not going to help them if they haven't included all the components in the study to begin with. Is that correct?
Correct. If they've fudged their reserve component list over the years, and if it misses major predictable projects, then the percent funded will not be a reliable indicator. Percent funded is only a reliable indicator when the reserve component list is a complete list.
Okay.
But time for me to turn the tables back to you. Who's responsible for the accuracy of that reserve component list? Can you address board member liability for budgeting and selecting the right components?
Well, simply by virtue of accepting a position as a board member, they are the members themselves taking on some level of liability, and board members are generally protected in their individual capacity by something called the business judgment rule, which basically says that so long as they're acting within the scope of their authority and they're acting reasonable, they will be protected in their individual capacity against liability. Now, what's reasonable and how do you act reasonable? Certainly when you're dealing with elements of an association that are outside your level of expertise, let's say, it's always a good idea to hire an independent, credentialed professional to help, especially with reserve studies. Of course, they're still responsible for making sure that the professional's work is reviewed and to provide all the information that the professional needs. It's garbage in, garbage out. If they're not fully come forward with all the information, the professional's work is only going to be based upon the information that they've been giving. If the association is relying upon a professional and they've done their due diligence and they've hired someone who is reputable, that is going to provide a certain level of protection for them. They certainly, in those set of circumstances, are acting reasonable. Of course, they need to make sure that that the review itself, that the professional doesn't make inadvertent mistakes. An example, if you have a new roof that's just been put on, has a 30-year life, and you see in the reserve study that the zero suddenly has been dropped off, it's just a human error. Instead of 30 years, it's 3 years. Well, they're still responsible for reviewing the professional's work. Many associations keep their review costs down by hiring a review study professional every year, and hopefully that will provide an added level of protection where if there was an inadvertent human error, you can perhaps pick up on them in the next year.
Great. Suppose just as you suggest, the board hires a firm like ours every few years for a professional with site visit update. If we ask a board member or manager for help asking when that new roof, well, it looks like a new roof, when it was installed, double checking who maintains the fencing or things like that, does that mean the board has taken the liability back on their shoulders?
Well, again, the reserve study professional is the one asking the questions, and they're the ones driving the process. Again, the board members are lay people, so if the professional is not asking the appropriate questions, then obviously the primary responsibility is going to lie with the professional.
Okay. Is liability even a real problem? Have you seen many cases on this issue, or is it just good practice in general for board members to keep their liability exposure low?
Well, it's never good for a board to invite liability exposure by any means. The boards need to make sure that they're complying with the state laws, they're complying with their governing documents. They need to make sure their reserve accounts are being properly funded and to get professional help when and where they're needed. Other ways to minimize their liability is to, like I said, act within the business judgment rule. Remember that they're a fiduciary responsible for everyone's interest, and they're not there to advance their own personal agenda. You may have some individuals who are on the board who are not going to be in the community for very much longer, and they want to lower their assessments for maybe from the short period of time that they're going to be there. That's an example where they may be pursuing their own personal agenda as opposed to advancing the interest of everyone as a whole.
Well, hopefully in those cases we've got a majority on the board who continues to press the right buttons and take good care of the community, and so hopefully the rogue board members with selfish interests are just the minority. Well, let me ask another one. What should a manager or board member do, or even a homeowner, if they feel their reserve component list might be a little bit on the thin side, meaning it's missing some components, or maybe even it's the opposite problem, that they think the association is taking on too much responsibility and reserving for too many components?
Well, that's interesting because they can always undertake their own analysis. They need to compare it to the state law. They need to compare it to their governing documents, certainly compare it to the national standards, and compare it to their operating budgets. Management professionals and board members, they're responsible for the association. The owners are relying upon them to do a good job, and if they don't feel that the board is doing it capable, or if they're not comfortable with the reserve study, then it's time for the association to hire a professional. And that's another thing, because as board members, Robert, maybe you can give them an example of some of the credentials they should be looking for when hiring these type of professionals.
Good question. The Reserve Specialist, or RS credential, is promoted and administered by CAI. It's what we call National Reserve Study Standards. There's also another almost identical credential. It's called the PRA, Professional Reserve Analyst. It's administered by the National Trade Organization for Reserve Study Professional, called APRA, APRA. The two credentials, for all practical purposes, are identical. So if you're looking for a Reserve Study Professional, look for someone with a RS or PRA after their name.
Okay, and are the reserve studies ever revised based upon client feedback and things of that nature?
Flipping the question back on me. Certainly. We view input from the client as helpful and valuable to the process. We bring our expertise to the table, but it's the owners, board members, and managers who bring the specific wealth of knowledge about association precedents, budget history, and obviously expense history there at the association. And sometimes, as you mentioned, there's just plain a mistake in the report, a typo, or we were provided the incorrect starting balance, something like that. And all those are reasons, great reasons to revise a reserve study. Well, I'm looking at the clock here, and we have so much that we could talk about on this topic of selecting your reserve components, but we're limited by time. So let me show you some additional resources we have at our disposal. I'm going to pop us out of the PowerPoint here and show you. Ray's with the firm Katzman, Garfinkel, and Berger, and if you go to their website, which is kgblawfirm.com, what I'm trying to do is make sure that we don't leave you hanging, because there's going to be so many questions that we're not going to be able to get to in today's time. You can see on the webpage they have a link called Classes and Events. So if you go to that link, you can see that they have board member basics, board member boot camps. Ray, can you give a real quick summary of these follow-up resources?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a whole list. There's probably about 6 or 7 pages listed of all the classes that we offer on our website. You mentioned the board member boot camp. That's a half a day, 5 or 6 hours, where we dress up as Army personnel. One of our senior attorneys is actually a retired captain, so he really gets into it. And everyone has a good fun. Last one we did, we had about 800 people show up.
Wow.
And if you go also to our website, there's a bunch of other materials that you'll find, one of them being a hurricane preparation guide. It's not just the classes. There's also periodicals there that you can also take advantage of.
Great. And for people needing a little more information about reserve studies, you can always go to our website, which is very simply reservestudy.com. And I would point you to the Learning Center. It's a resource of collected articles on different topics, and if you actually want a proposal, you can very simply just click a link for Request a Proposal here to the right-hand side of the page. And hopefully between those two things that'll solve your follow-up questions. But let me get back to the PowerPoint and see if we can wrap this up. I'm going to zoom ahead to the final page here. We want to thank you all for joining us today. Again, there's a wealth of information. This is what Ray and I do on an ongoing basis every day throughout the year. We want to make sure that you have not only some great ideas that you're leaving the session today with, but also some resources that you can use in the future. So speaking for the both of us, it's been a pleasure to go through this conversation today with legal expert Raymond Pachin. And that concludes the formal part of our presentation. Raymond and I have arranged to stay on the line for a few more minutes to deal with the questions that you've typed in while we've been speaking. And so at this point in time, Chris, I'd like to turn the floor over to you to act as moderator for some questions that people have submitted. Chris?